The emergency briefing room fell silent as President William Ruto burst through the doors, his face dark with barely contained fury. The mahogany table, polished to mirror perfection, reflected the trembling of his hands as he slammed down a thick intelligence report. The sound echoed like thunder through the room lined with portraits of Kenya's founding fathers, men who had once stirred similar storms. Behind him loomed a massive photograph projected on the wall, thousands of Kenyan youth flooding the streets just hours before. Their homemade banners, crafted from bedsheets and cardboard, bore a single name in bold red letters: Traoré. "This ends now," Ruto growled, his voice cracking with something deeper than anger: fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize the ground beneath your feet is shifting. National Security Advisor Margaret Kimani cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, our preliminary analysis shows this isn't organized by any political opposition. It's organic, spontaneous. The youth are organizing themselves through WhatsApp groups, TikTok, and university networks." "Organic?" Ruto's voice rose. "Foreign influence is never organic, Margaret. Someone is funding this, someone with deep pockets and deeper motives." But Intelligence Chief Samuel Rodich shook his head slowly. "Sir, we've traced the communications. No foreign money, no external coordination. These are our own children, using their own phones, walking with their own feet. The only foreign element is a speech that went viral." The morning had started like any other in the corridors of power. Cabinet meetings about infrastructure, budget allocations, the usual machinery of governance grinding forward. But by noon, something had shifted in the air of Nairobi. The streets pulsed with an energy no intelligence briefing had predicted. Young people wearing red, green, and black, the Pan-African colors, filled every avenue from Uhuru Park to the University of Nairobi. But this wasn't the chaotic energy of typical protests. Their movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. They walked in formation, their voices unified in chanting a name that had traveled 3,000 miles from the dusty plains of Burkina Faso to the heart of Kenya. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His speech had gone viral just 48 hours earlier. One line had cut through the digital noise like lightning through storm clouds. "We are not poor, we are being robbed." Within hours, that single sentence echoed through university dormitories where students counted coins for supper, through mechanic workshops where young men worked double shifts for half wages, through boda stations where riders calculated fuel costs against daily earnings, and through family WhatsApp groups where mothers watched their educated children still living at home. By the second day, it wasn't just trending, it was transforming. The youth weren't just watching anymore. They were organizing, questioning, and most dangerously of all, believing. 3 days earlier, in a modest room with bare concrete walls and a flickering ceiling fan, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had stood before a simple wooden podium. The room was Spartan by design. No teleprompters casting artificial light, no grand orchestras waiting in the wings, no flashing cameras or golden curtains. Just truth pressing down on his shoulders like the accumulated weight of a continent's unfulfilled promises. The few dozen gathered there represented no political party, held no official titles. They were teachers, students, small business owners, farmers, ordinary citizens who had requested this meeting not for spectacle, but for clarity. He wore no medals, no ceremonial sash. His red beret sat simple and unpretentious on his head. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm fire of a man who had seen enough and could no longer stay silent. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his hands resting gently on the podium, "we gather not to celebrate power, but to remember truth. For too long, we have been told stories about ourselves that serve others, not us." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle like dust after a storm. "We are not poor, we are being robbed," he said, each word measured, deliberate, final. The room remained still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. But it wasn't the few dozen gathered there who would truly hear him. It was the millions watching from cracked phone screens across Africa, especially in places like Nairobi, Eldoret, Mombasa, and Kisumu. "Look at your hands," Traoré continued, raising his own calloused palms. "These hands build houses we cannot afford. They grow food we cannot buy. They extract gold that never fills our pockets. They educate children who graduate into an employment designed to keep them desperate." A mechanic in Eastland's Nairobi, watching on his phone during a lunch break, looked down at his oil-stained fingers and nodded slowly. "We don't lack talent, we lack justice," Traoré said, his fist coming down on the podium with quiet authority. "We don't lack resources, we lack respect. We don't lack intelligence, we lack the courage to trust ourselves." Within hours, young Kenyans began cutting his speech into 30-second clips, adding Swahili and Sheng subtitles. Grace, a computer science student at Kenyatta University, spent her entire night creating subtitle files. "This needs to reach everyone," she whispered to a roommate at 3 a.m., her eyes burning from screen glare. The speech spread like wildfire across TikTok, then exploded through Telegram groups where university students shared study materials, and finally landed in family WhatsApp chats where mothers forwarded it with messages like, "Listen to this man speak truth." A video of Traoré gently striking the table as he said, "We don't lack talent, we lack justice," reached 1 million views in 8 hours. Young creators layered his words over drone shots of Kibera's iron sheet roofs stretching to the horizon, over black and white photographs of colonial-era protests, over images of politicians' luxury cars parked outside poverty-stricken schools. It wasn't propaganda, it was recognition. They saw their own betrayal reflected in his words, their own stolen dignity echoing in his voice. When Traoré said, "They call us lazy because we refuse to serve them as slaves," it struck harder than any economic report, deeper than any political promise, more precisely than any academic theory ever could. Inside State House, the reaction was instant and chaotic. Digital media advisors huddled around laptops, pulling up analytics that showed massive spikes in search terms they'd never monitored before. The patterns were alarming. These searches weren't coming from political circles or radical forums, but from high schools in Nakuru, university campuses in Eldoret, Boda Boda routes in Kisumu, and even churches in Mombasa. Communications Director Sarah Wambui stared at the data with growing unease. "Sir, the engagement rates are unlike anything we've seen. Higher than election season, higher than the protests of 2017, and it's not political opposition driving this, it's completely organic." Pastor Michael Kiprotich, from a youth church in Karen, shared Traoré's speech during Sunday service, weaving it into a sermon about Moses challenging Pharaoh. His congregation of young professionals had listened with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. After the service, they didn't discuss his sermon, they discussed Traoré's words. Teachers at Starehe Boys Center printed excerpts for classroom discussions on African leadership. The principal had approved it as contemporary political analysis, but by Wednesday, he was fielding calls from concerned parents asking why their sons were suddenly questioning career paths in government. Even more unsettling, a primary school teacher in Nakuru caught her Standard 7 students whispering Traoré's words during break time. "We are not poor, we are being robbed," 8-year-old voices repeated like a playground chant. The government's media team scrambled into damage control mode. They produced polished videos featuring well-dressed economists from the University of Nairobi explaining why Traoré's message didn't apply to Kenya's growing economy. Dr. Patricia Muburu, wearing a crisp blazer and sitting in a book-lined office, spoke directly to the camera. "Kenya has made tremendous strides in economic growth. We cannot allow foreign populism to undermine legitimate progress." The comment section exploded within hours. "You live in a mansion in Karen, he sleeps with his soldiers," one response read. Another, "Easy to talk about growth when your salary pays rent for 20 families." The government team tried another approach, producing a slick documentary attempting to paint Traoré as anti-progress, highlighting Burkina Faso's challenges while showcasing Kenya's infrastructure projects. But university students fact-checked every claim with the raw anger of the betrayed. In one response video that garnered 2 million views, a student at Maseno University stared directly into his phone camera, speaking in mixture of English and Luo. "If progress means I work 12 hours at 3 different jobs and still can't afford a 1-bedroom flat in the cheapest estate, then brother, you can keep your progress." Traoré isn't offering us solutions, he's offering us the courage to ask better questions. The tension that had been simmering across Kenya's universities finally boiled over during Professor James Mwangi's African Geopolitics lecture at the University of Nairobi. The respected academic, known for his sharp critiques of populism and his disciplined approach to continental politics, paced before his packed lecture hall in his perfectly pressed suit and wire-rimmed glasses. Professor Mwangi had built his reputation on careful analysis, on distinguishing between emotional rhetoric and practical governance. His students respected him, even feared him slightly. His approval meant access to graduate programs and research opportunities. "I've read this so-called speech by Captain Traoré," he began, with the dismissive chuckle his students knew well. "And I must say, it represents everything that's wrong with African political discourse today. It's performance, not policy, emotion, not economics. He's nothing more than a street preacher with a military badge." The usual rustle of notebooks and pens stopped. The 200 students in the amphitheater-style classroom sat unusually still. "Anyone falling for his simplistic rhetoric," Professor Mwangi continued, removing his glasses to clean them with theatrical precision, "is simply too emotional to understand the complexities of governance, structure, and sustainable development. This is exactly why Africa needs intellectual leadership, not military populism." The silence that followed wasn't the respectful attention Professor Mwangi expected. It was the heavy quiet that precedes lightning. A chair scraped back from the third row. Zubair Hassan, a third-year student known more for his thoughtful essays than his vocal participation, stood up slowly. His voice, when it came, was steady but sharp as broken glass. "Professor," Zubair said, his hands trembling slightly but his words clear, "you taught us Frantz Fanon and Kwame Nkrumah. You made us memorize the theories of dependency and the frameworks of decolonization, but Traoré gave us something you never did." The classroom held its breath. "He gave us voice," Zubair continued, his confidence growing with each word. "For 4 years, we've memorized frameworks written by men who never walked through Mathare slums or worked in Eastland's workshops. We've dissected texts by scholars who theorized about poverty from university offices. But not once did I feel seen. Not once did I feel like I had the right to demand more from my own country until I heard him." Professor Mwangi's face tightened, but Zubair wasn't finished. "He didn't give us all the answers, sir. He gave us a mirror. He made me look at my own country, our Kenyan politicians driving in motorcades past unemployed graduates, our resources exported while our mothers boil leaves for tea, and ask, is this the best we can do? And the scariest part for you, Professor, is that I no longer think it is." The classroom erupted. Applause thundered off the walls, growing louder and more sustained until even students who hadn't been paying attention were standing and clapping. Some were recording on their phones, others were simply absorbing the moment when academic theory met lived reality. Professor Mwangi's face tightened visibly. His authority, built over decades, was cracking in real time. "Sit down, Mr. Hassan. This is an academic space, not a theater for revolutionary fantasies. If you can't distinguish between intellectual rigor and emotional manipulation, perhaps you need to reconsider your academic trajectory." But the moment had already passed beyond his control. Students were pulling out phones, filming and sharing. The clip would go viral before Zubair even left the building, spreading across university campuses nationwide with captions like "Student Bodies Professor with Truth" and "When Education Meets Reality." Grace, the computer science student who had subtitled Traoré's original speech, was in that classroom. She uploaded the video within minutes, adding context about Professor Mwangi's government consulting work. The internet did the rest. The call came during the mid-morning segment of Citizen Radio's popular talk show Mazungumzo ya Asubuhi, Morning Conversations. Host James Kimani was discussing rising food prices with his usual mix of expert guests and citizen call-ins when the switchboard lit up with a call from Eldoret. The voice was soft, almost trembling, but carried a firmness that made everyone in the studio stop their side conversations and listen. "Good morning, Wana Kimani," the woman said, in careful English mixed with Kiswahili. "My name is Mama Njore. I am calling about my son." "Karibu, Mama Njore," James replied warmly, expecting another story about school fees or unemployment. "Tell us what's happening with your son." He didn't go to his job interviews this week. 3 of them. Good positions: bank teller, insurance clerk, hotel receptionist. He has a degree in business administration from Moi University, first-class honors. But he just stayed home. Not sick, not lazy, just quiet. James leaned forward, sensing something deeper. "And what did you tell him, Mama?" "I asked him why. You know how we mothers are. We don't let our children waste opportunities." He looked at me with eyes I had never seen before. Tired eyes, old eyes in a young face. He said, "Mama, I'm done begging to be underpaid. I'm done pretending that gratitude for exploitation is humility. That captain from Burkina Faso, he made me believe my labor shouldn't be cheap." The radio studio fell silent. Dead air filled the frequencies across Kenya, something that never happens during prime morning time. James fumbled for words before managing to say, "We'll be right back after this commercial break." But in radio stations across Kenya, producers were already pulling the audio. Within an hour, Mama Njore's voice was clipped and circulating on Twitter with captions like, "Mother explains why her son refused 3 job interviews after hearing Traoré." By lunchtime, the audio had reached millions of phones. The clip had no background music, no professional editing, just a mother's voice, raw, trembling, and impossible to ignore. WhatsApp groups shared it with messages like, "This is why our children are angry," and "Listen to this mama speak truth." In a cramped apartment in South B Estate, Grace worked through another sleepless night. Her laptop overheated twice as she coordinated with dozens of other young people across East Africa, creating a digital infrastructure for something that had no name yet. "We're not building a political movement," she typed into a secure Telegram group at 4 a.m. "We're building a mirror for Africa to see itself clearly." Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Students from Makerere University in Uganda were translating Traoré's words into Luganda. Youth in Tanzania were creating Swahili versions. In Rwanda, young entrepreneurs were organizing dignity dialogues in coffee shops. But Kenya was different. Kenya was on fire. Samuel, a 23-year-old graphic designer from Kibera, had created a simple logo, an outline of the African continent with a seed growing from its center. No words, no party symbols, just the image. Within 48 hours, it appeared on T-shirts, painted on matatu sides, and drawn in school notebooks across the country. The government's digital surveillance team worked overtime trying to track the coordination, but there was no central command defined. It was like trying to catch smoke. Every time they identified a group or leader, the movement had already shifted, evolved, grown beyond that structure. Wanjiku, the young woman who would later confront politicians on live television, spent her days teaching other youth how to fact-check information, how to organize peaceful gatherings, how to turn their anger into something constructive. Her day job as a customer service representative at a call center barely paid her rent, but her evening work as a digital organizer was feeding her soul. "The adults think we're being manipulated," she posted in one of the coordination groups. "They can't imagine that we're capable of being inspired." The broadcast was unannounced, appearing suddenly on Burkina Faso's national television without fanfare or preliminary programming. A simple frame materialized on screens. Captain Traoré seated at the same plain wooden desk, his red beret resting to the side, speaking directly to a continent that had been holding its breath. "Brothers and sisters across Africa," he began, his hands folded carefully on the table, "I have been told that my words traveled far beyond these walls. To the youth of Kenya, of South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Tanzania, let me be clear. I did not speak to provoke. I spoke because silence is expensive, and Africa has paid enough." He paused, letting the weight of accumulated centuries settle in the space between his words. "I see the marches in Nairobi. I hear the voices in Lagos. I witness the courage in Accra. You owe no loyalty to me, only to the truth. To the youth of Kenya, specifically, I thank you, not because you raised my name in your streets, but because you raised your heads in your own country." His voice carried across borders, through fiber optic cables and satellite signals, reaching phones in matatu stations and university dormitories. "But let me say something important," Traoré continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Stand with dignity, not destruction. Let your silence be more powerful than your shouting. What we are building across this continent is fragile, like a seed just breaking through hard soil. The world is watching us, hoping we will tear ourselves apart again, hoping we will prove their stories about African chaos." Looking directly into the camera, he concluded with words that would be memorized by millions. "We are not building a movement, my young brothers and sisters. We are remembering who we are. And what we are remembering is that our ancestors gave us roots strong enough to grow new trees." In Kisumu, something unprecedented began at dawn on Saturday morning. Collins Oching, a 22-year-old unemployed university graduate, had organized something he called the Traoré Method through a simple WhatsApp message to his friends. "Tomorrow, we show them what dignity looks like." Dozens of young people gathered at Jubilee Market, not with protest signs or political banners, but with work boots, gloves, cleaning supplies, and a quiet determination that unsettled the watching police officers. Collins wore a white t-shirt with words written in black marker across the back. "Dignity isn't given. We're cleaning what's been ignored." They moved as a coordinated unit, but without military precision, more like a family working together. They cleared blocked drainage channels that had been flooding the market for months. They repainted the walls of a community health clinic. They removed garbage that had been piling up since the last strike by county workers. When municipal officers arrived with permits and legal notices about unauthorized public activity, Collins extended a gloved hand covered in paint and said simply, "Officer, we're not holding a gathering, we're not protesting, we're just fixing what's broken." The officers looked around the transformed street, at the young people working quietly and efficiently, at the community members who had begun to bring them water and grateful smiles. They folded their papers and walked away. Similar scenes erupted across Kenya that weekend. In Nakuru, youth organized a cleanup of the main bus station. In Mombasa, they repaired potholes on a road the county government had ignored for 2 years. In Yeti, they painted a mural at a school and fixed broken desks. They didn't ask for government approval or NGO funding. They didn't wait for permits or official recognition. They just acted, demonstrating the dignity that Traoré had reminded them they possessed. The images went viral not because of their political message, but because of their quiet power. Here were young people who had been dismissed as lazy, proving their worth not with words, but with work. Not with destruction, but with construction. The tension that had been building across Kenya for weeks finally exploded during a parliamentary session that would be replayed on news channels for months afterward. Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah rose to address Speaker Moses Wetang'ula directly, his voice carrying the frustration of an establishment under pressure. Mr. Speaker, we cannot remain silent while foreign influence systematically reshapes the consciousness of our youth. This so-called Traoré phenomenon is nothing less than external manipulation designed to destabilize Kenya's democratic institutions. The chamber buzzed with murmurs of agreement from the government benches, but opposition whip Junet Mohammed was already on his feet, requesting to respond. Mr. Speaker, if Captain Traoré's message is reshaping anything in this country, it's because there was a vacuum here to begin with. Our young people are not traitors, they are not foreigners, they are tired. Tired of promises that evaporate like morning dew. Tired of being told to be patient while their lives pass by waiting. The chamber erupted with competing voices, but Mohammed continued over the noise. And, maybe, just maybe, we should ask ourselves why words from Burkina Faso moved them more than speeches from this very parliament. Then something unexpected happened. Janae Wanjiku Nkwene, the nominated MP from Busia, rose slowly from the back benches. The chamber gradually quieted, recognizing that she rarely spoke, but was always worth hearing when she did. Honorable Speaker, she began, her voice carrying the authority of personal experience. I was raised by a single mother who sold vegetables by the roadside in Busia Market. She told me every morning, you must work twice as hard to be seen half as much. I believed her. I worked. I studied. I fought my way to this chamber. Her voice grew stronger. But when I visit my constituency today, I see our youth working 3 times as hard and still being invisible. I see graduates with first-class honors working as watchmen. I see young entrepreneurs crushed by systems designed for corruption. If Captain Traoré's words stirred them, maybe we should ask why ours did not. The chamber fell silent in a way that rarely happened during heated political debates. Then something even more unprecedented occurred. Speaker Moses Wetang'ula himself, traditionally neutral in such matters, slowly removed his glasses and spoke directly to the assembly. Honorable members, he said, his voice carrying decades of parliamentary experience. I've served in this House for a long time. I've seen speeches that moved political parties and bills that collapsed governments. But I've never seen an entire country moved by silence until now. He paused, looking across the chamber filled with Kenya's elected representatives. Let me quote this Captain Traoré directly, since we are all dancing around his words anyway. He said, "The youth are not lazy, they are exhausted from being ignored." If that sentence can mobilize hundreds of thousands of our children to march in our streets, perhaps we should examine not their hearts, but our own ears. Street vendors closed their stalls, not in fear, but in respect. Matatu drivers turned off their music. Even the notorious Nairobi traffic seemed to quiet itself in recognition of something unprecedented happening. At Uhuru Park, the final destination, the three symbolic leaders, Wanjiku, Zubair, and Mama Njoroge, simply sat down on the grass. One by one, like a human wave flowing backward, rows behind them followed. They sat on asphalt, sidewalks, park benches, and grass. Nearly 1 million people with no weapon but their presence, no demand but to be seen. President Ruto watched from State House through live television feeds that showed the city transformed. His security advisors were nervous, but there was nothing to secure against. No violence, no destruction, just the overwhelming power of people who had decided to matter. The march ended 3 hours later, as quietly as it had begun. They cleaned up after themselves, every piece of litter, every trampled flower bed restored. They helped elderly citizens to their feet, ensured lost children found their families, and then dispersed into the city as silently as they had arrived. But something had shifted forever in the consciousness of a nation. Inside All Saints Cathedral, an unprecedented gathering took place on the Sunday following the March of 1 Million. Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus filled the pews together in a show of interfaith unity that surprised even the organizers. Church elders sat beside imams, bishops next to sheikhs, Hindu priests alongside Sikh gurus. Archbishop Jackson Oli Sapit spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of spiritual authority and personal reflection. My own son asked me why the church was silent while his friends marched in the streets. I had no answer that satisfied either him or my own conscience. So I came here today not to preach, but to apologize. The cathedral was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds listening through speakers in the courtyard. We taught them to be humble, the Archbishop continued, but perhaps we forgot to teach them their own worth. We told them to wait for heaven while they lived in hell. This young captain from Burkina Faso reminded them that dignity is not a luxury, it is a birthright. Chief Qadi Sheikh Ahmad Mudhar followed, his words carrying the authority of Islamic leadership. In Islam, we teach that Allah speaks through all of creation, through the wind and the rain, through stones and rivers. Why should we be surprised when He speaks through the voices of our youth? They are not trying to replace us, they are trying to remind us who we once were when we were young and still believed change was possible. From the back of the cathedral, representatives of the National Muslim Christian Youth Alliance rose in unison, dressed in plain white, their heads bowed not in submission, but in reverence for what they had witnessed in their generation. Rabbi Moshe Silberhaft from the small but significant Jewish community in Nairobi spoke about the prophetic tradition. The prophets of old were always young when they first heard the voice of justice calling. Perhaps we have been so busy teaching our children to respect authority that we forgot to teach them to recognize truth. The Hindu priest from the temple and parklands concluded, "In our tradition, we believe that truth has many faces. The face it showed us through Captain Traoré and through our own children is one we had not been ready to see. But seeing it now, we cannot close our eyes again." The broadcast was announced only 15 minutes before it aired, appearing on Kenya Broadcasting Corporation without the usual presidential fanfare. The screen faded in without music, graphics, or ceremonial backdrops, just President William Ruto sitting in a simple wooden chair in what appeared to be his private office. No podium separated him from the camera, no Kenyan flag provided symbolic authority, no aides hovered just outside the frame, just a man in a plain navy suit facing his nation, and perhaps for the first time in his political career, himself. "My fellow Kenyans," he began, his voice softer than the country was accustomed to hearing. "Maybe I was wrong." The admission hit the airwaves like lightning, spreading across social media within seconds. Politicians don't usually begin national addresses by admitting error. "Not wrong about what I said," he continued, looking directly into the camera, "but wrong about what I didn't hear. Wrong about what I refused to see." He looked down for a moment, as if collecting something fragile from the depths of memory. "When I first saw young people marching in silence through our streets, I thought this was disobedience. When I heard them chanting the words of a soldier from Burkina Faso, I thought this was foreign influence trying to destabilize our democracy. But now I understand something that my advisor's reports could never tell me." His voice broke slightly before continuing. "It wasn't rebellion I was witnessing. It was grief. You were grieving a country you were promised and never received. You were mourning opportunities that were stolen, dreams that were deferred, dignity that was denied." He paused, and for a moment, the most powerful man in Kenya looked like any father trying to understand his children.
"You carried the burden of our pride. We told you that Kenya is great, but we never let you feel great as Kenyans. We told you to be patient while we lived in comfort. We told you to work harder while we worked less. We told you to respect authority while we abused it." The commitments he made were concrete and immediate. Effective immediately, there will be no more permits denied to peaceful gatherings, no more surveillance of student groups asking honest questions about their government, no more intimidation of young people who dared to dream of a better Kenya. But his most significant promise was structural. Beginning next month, a National Civic Assembly will be formed, with half its membership composed of citizens under the age of 35. Not token representation, real power to shape policy, allocate resources, and hold government accountable. His final words were delivered in a whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shouted speech. "Thank you, young people of Kenya, for teaching me what power sounds like when it's quiet. Thank you for showing me that strength doesn't need to be loud to be real. Thank you for loving this country enough to demand better from it." The mural appeared overnight on the side of the Ministry of Education building in downtown Nairobi, covering the entire 4-story wall with an image so powerful that traffic stopped to stare. No one had witnessed its creation. No security cameras had captured the artists at work, but by dawn on August 20th, it was there, complete, perfect, and undeniable. On the left side of the mural stood Captain Traoré, not portrayed as a military figure, but as a symbol of awakened consciousness. His red beret caught the morning light, but his eyes looked inward, contemplative. His hands were open, palms up, offering rather than commanding. On the right side stood President Ruto, not depicted in the regalia of power, but in simple clothes, his face turned skyward in thought, his posture suggesting a man who had been humbled by truth rather than defeated by opposition. Between them, in the center of the mural, knelt a child whose face combined features that represented all of Kenya's ethnic communities. The child's hands were pressed into rich, dark soil, cradling a small sapling whose leaves seemed to shimmer with their own light. Above them all, painted in flowing Swahili script that seemed to dance across the sky, "Afrika haisubiri mabadiliko, inapanda." Africa isn't waiting for change, it's planting it. Within hours, the mural became a pilgrimage site.
People came not to take selfies or make political statements, but to stand quietly and absorb what it represented. Mothers brought their children to explain what they had witnessed in their lifetime. University students brought their notebooks to sketch details and write reflections. No artist ever claimed responsibility for the mural. When journalists pressed local painters and art students, they shrugged and smiled. When city officials investigated security footage, they found only empty frames, as if the cameras had politely looked away while the future was being painted. A local elder, asked about the mysterious appearance of the artwork, simply said with a knowing smile, "It wasn't painted, Bwana. It was remembered." What began as a single correspondence between two African leaders became something unprecedented in modern diplomacy. The first letter arrived at State House Nairobi through official channels, sealed with the simple stamp of Burkina Faso's transitional government. Your Excellency, President Ruto, I write not as a military leader to a civilian president, but as one African to another who has witnessed his people awaken. The courage of Kenya's youth has reached us here in Ouagadougou. They carry themselves with a dignity that reminds us why we still believe in this continent's future. President Ruto's response, released publicly per both leaders' agreement, marked a new kind of African diplomacy. Captain Traoré, your words traveled 3,000 miles to remind our children of their worth. Perhaps the greatest gift one African leader can give another is the courage to listen to his own people. The correspondence continued over months, but these weren't typical diplomatic exchanges focused on trade agreements or security cooperation. Instead, they grappled with questions that kept both leaders awake at night. How do you lead a generation that has lost faith in leadership? How do you rebuild trust when the foundation of credibility has cracked? How do you balance the patience required for institutional change with the urgency of youthful expectations? The letters became required reading in Kenyan universities, not as government propaganda, but as examples of vulnerable leadership. Students analyzed them not for political science, but for their humanity. Two men trying to understand how to serve rather than rule. Grace, the computer science student who had become an informal coordinator of the youth movement, read them all and posted a response that went viral. They're learning to govern by learning to listen. Maybe that's what African leadership was always supposed to be. In the months that followed the March of a Million, Kenya transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The changes weren't announced through government press releases or captured in policy documents, but they were real, spreading through society like roots through soil. Youth assemblies formed organically in counties that had been politically ignored for decades. In Turkana, young people organized water conservation projects without waiting for NGO funding. In Kawale, coastal youth created sustainable fishing cooperatives. In Samburi, pastoralist youth developed drought-resistant farming techniques that their grandparents' generation embraced with surprise and pride. Mama Njoroge, whose radio call had crystallized a nation's feelings, found herself invited to speak at university graduations. Her message was always simple. I didn't raise my son to be grateful for crumbs. I raised him to bake bread. Universities began offering her honorary doctorates, but she declined them all, saying, "The youth gave me a degree in truth. That's enough." Zubair returned to his classes at the University of Nairobi, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. Professor Mwangi, humbled by the viral confrontation, restructured his curriculum to include more African voices, more contemporary analysis, more space for students to question rather than just memorize. The first time Zubair raised his hand after the incident, the entire class held its breath. But his question was scholarly, respectful, and penetrating. "Professor, how do we distinguish between academic objectivity and intellectual cowardice?" Professor Mwangi paused, smiled slightly, and responded, "Mr. Hassan, That might be the most important question asked in this classroom in 20 years. Wanjiku established the Community Dialogue Forum, which met every Saturday morning in different neighborhoods across Nairobi. No politicians were allowed, no cameras permitted, just citizens talking to citizens about the Kenya they wanted to build. The forum spread to other cities, other countries. Within a year, similar gatherings were happening from Accra to Lagos, from Kampala to Kigali. The movement that had begun with Traoré's words about Africa being robbed, not poor, began manifesting in concrete economic changes. Young entrepreneurs stopped accepting exploitative contracts from multinational corporations. University graduates organized cooperatives rather than competing desperately for scarce employment. In Nakuru, a group of agricultural science graduates pooled their resources to buy land collectively, implementing sustainable farming practices that tripled yields while maintaining soil health. They called their model Unyama ya Kizazi Kipya, New Generation Collectivism, borrowing from Nyerere's philosophy but adapting it for contemporary realities. Tech hubs in Nairobi's High Hub and NALAB experienced a shift in the types of startups being incubated. Instead of apps designed to attract foreign investment, young developers focused on solutions for local problems: water management systems for slums, educational platforms in local languages, financial tools for informal sector workers. The government, recognizing this organic economic transformation, established the Youth Innovation Fund with unprecedented transparency. Every allocation was published online, every project's progress tracked publicly, every success and failure documented for future learning. Samuel, the graphic designer from Kibera, who had created the Seed and Continent logo, found his simple image appearing on products across Kenya. T-shirt vendors, matutu operators, small businesses adopted the symbol organically. He never trademarked it, never tried to profit from its popularity. He said, "It belongs to all of us." The transformation in Kenya didn't occur in isolation. Across East Africa, similar awakenings began stirring. Uganda's youth, inspired by Kenya's example, organized dignity dialogues in universities and communities. Tanzania's young entrepreneurs established cooperative networks that bypassed traditional economic hierarchies. In Rwanda, young people who had grown up in the post-genocide reconstruction began asking new questions about the future they wanted to build. Ethiopia's diverse ethnic communities found common ground in conversations about economic justice that transcended political divisions. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in South Africa, where the youth movement that had been simmering since the #FeesMustFall protests found new direction and purpose. South African students began quoting Traoré alongside Steve Biko, connecting Pan-Africanist philosophy with contemporary economic analysis. The African Union, initially nervous about these youth movements crossing borders, eventually embraced them as examples of the kind of continental consciousness that founding fathers like Nkrumah and Nasser had envisioned. A special session on youth-led continental development was organized, with Traoré and Ruto as keynote speakers. International media struggled to categorize what was happening across Africa. The usual frameworks, political instability, economic crisis, ethnic conflict, didn't apply to movements characterized by dignity, construction, and cross-ethnic solidarity. The World Bank commissioned studies to understand how grassroots economic cooperatives were achieving better development outcomes than traditional aid programs. The International Monetary Fund sent observers to understand why African youth were increasingly rejecting loan-dependent development models. European universities began offering exchange programs specifically focused on African youth innovation, recognizing that the continent was producing models of sustainable development that challenged Western assumptions about progress and growth. But the most significant international response came from African diaspora communities. Young Africans in London, New York, Toronto, and Paris began organizing dignity circles, applying lessons from home to their experiences of marginalization in Western societies. Mary Wanjira, a 19-year-old student at Kenyatta University, had been planning to drop out due to financial pressure. Her parents, small-scale farmers in Kiambu, couldn't afford her fees despite selling everything they could. After hearing Traoré's speech and participating in the March of a Million, she organized a student cooperative that provided peer tutoring and skills training. Within 6 months, she was earning enough to pay her fees while helping other students avoid dropping out. Patrick Otieno, a 26-year-old mechanic in Kisumu, had been struggling to expand his workshop despite having the skills and customer demand. Banks wouldn't give him loans without collateral he didn't possess. Inspired by the community organizing he witnessed, he joined with 5 other mechanics to create a cooperative workshop. They pooled resources, shared customers, and mentored apprentices. Within a year, their cooperative was thriving and training the next generation of skilled workers. Sarah Muthoni, a 30-year-old teacher in Nyeri, had been contemplating leaving Kenya to work in the Middle East, like many of her colleagues. The promise of higher wages abroad seemed like the only path to economic security. But after participating in local dialogue forums and seeing the changes happening around her, she decided to stay and innovate within the system. She developed teaching methods that combined traditional Kenyan wisdom with modern pedagogy, creating education models that other teachers began adopting across the region. The transformation wasn't without obstacles and setbacks. Not everyone embraced the changes, and the movement faced resistance from various quarters. Some politicians, particularly those who had built careers on ethnic division and patronage systems, attempted to co-opt or undermine the youth movements. They organized counter-rallies, spread misinformation about foreign funding, and tried to paint the movements as anti-government rather than pro-governance. Certain religious leaders worried about the reduction in traditional deference to authority, arguing that respect for elders and institutions was being eroded. Some parents struggled to understand their children's new assertiveness, interpreting confidence as disrespect. International corporations that had benefited from cheap African labor and resources began lobbying their home governments to pressure African states to maintain stability, a code word for preserving exploitative economic relationships. Even within the youth movements, disagreements emerged about tactics, priorities, and the pace of change. Some wanted faster political transformation, while others focused on economic empowerment. Some emphasized local solutions, while others pushed for continental coordination. But these challenges, rather than weakening the movement, seemed to strengthen it by forcing deeper conversations about values, goals, and methods. The youth who had been awakened by Traoré's words proved capable of navigating complexity without losing their core commitment to dignity and justice. 2 years after Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words first traveled from Ouagadougou to Nairobi, the changes in Kenya had become integrated into the fabric of society. What had begun as a moment of inspiration had evolved into a sustained transformation that touched every aspect of national life. The mural on the Ministry of Education building was now protected by city ordinance, declared a national monument to the awakening of 2025. But more importantly, someone had planted a real tree beneath the painted child's hands. By the 2nd anniversary, its leaves actually reached the painted palms, creating a living bridge between art and reality. Grace had graduated with her computer science degree and launched a tech company focused on governance transparency tools. Her software was being used by youth assemblies across Africa to track government promises and measure policy outcomes. Zubair completed his studies and was accepted to graduate programs at universities across the world, but chose to stay in Kenya to establish the Institute for African Youth Leadership. His first cohort included young people from 12 African countries, all committed to leadership models based on listening rather than commanding. Mama Njoroge became an informal elder stateswoman for the movement, consulted by everyone from university students to government ministers. Her simple wisdom, "Children grow best in soil that's been prepared with love and honesty," was quoted in academic papers and policy documents. The correspondence between President Ruto and Captain Traoré continued, evolving into a broader dialogue involving young African leaders across the continent. Their letters were published annually in a collection that became one of the best-selling books in Africa, with proceeds funding youth development programs. State House had indeed felt different in the 2 years since the awakening. Ministers spoke more carefully, knowing that young people were watching and fact-checking. Policies were debated not just for their political impact, but for their effect on Kenya's youth. A new Department of Public Listening had been established, tasked with creating ongoing dialogue between government and citizens. The economic changes were measurable. Youth unemployment had decreased not because more jobs were created, but because young people were creating their own opportunities. University enrollment increased as students saw education as a tool for community development rather than individual escape. Brain drain slowed as young Kenyans found ways to build meaningful careers at home. But perhaps the most significant change was intangible, a shift in how Kenyans saw themselves and their possibilities. The country that had often felt like a collection of tribes competing for resources began feeling like a community working toward shared prosperity. In the final analysis, etched into the concrete base of the real tree growing beneath the mural, someone had carved a sentence in small, uneven handwriting that captured the essence of what had happened.
And so, without speeches or laws or flags or foreign intervention, Kenya had found itself not reborn, but reawakened. Not because of a charismatic leader or revolutionary ideology, but because a generation had remembered its worth, and a nation had dared to listen. The tree continued growing, its roots deepening, its branches spreading, providing shade for future generations who would inherit not just a country, but a belief that they deserved better, and the confidence to create it. In schools across Kenya, now children learn the story of the awakening alongside traditional history lessons. They studied not the speeches of politicians, but the quiet courage of young people who had chosen dignity over desperation, construction over destruction, hope over resignation. And sometimes, when the wind blew through the leaves of the tree beneath the mural, older residents swore they could hear something like whispers, the voices of ancestors who had dreamed of this moment, when their children's children would finally remember how to stand tall.